各位，前联合国资深外交官马凯硕长期研究亚洲和西方的关系，在最新的一场演讲中，他提醒大家，别着急着对中国下赌注，因为中美竞争不仅是特朗普的个人政策，而是一场更长远的地缘政治博弈。那为什么中美之间的竞争不是偶然，而是长期必然的呢？
The US-China geopolitical contest was launched by Donald Trump, but it will outlast Trump. Unfortunately, Biden proved me correct. He continued it. Even Biden and Trump disagreed on everything except on China. So there is obviously a bipartisan consensus in the United States on China. And as I explain in my book, what the US is doing is rational behavior of superpower. No superpower ever gives up its number one status willingly, never. It'll fight to maintain it as long as possible. So sometime in the next 10 to 15 years, China's economy will become number one, and United States, for the first time in 130, 140 years, will become the number two economic power in the world. Now, that will be a huge shock for the United States. And so when the United States is going all out to stop the rise of China, that is normal behavior. We should expect it. That's what happens for thousands of years of history. But of course, we hope that the contest will be played out peacefully and not in the form of a major war between the two sides. And I think we can prevent a war between US and China, but it requires a process, a very complex process of them talking to each other regularly so that they understand clearly where each other's red lines are. And that, unfortunately, is not happening now. So on US and China, I'm actually somewhat, what I think on Taiwan, they have receded. The danger of a nuclear war has receded. The overall relationship remains very difficult. And just today, a friend of mine in Washington, D.C. sent me a message. He's a very seasoned observer of Washington, D.C. He said, "Sure, the mood in Washington, D.C. today is so anti-China that if Biden gives any hint that he's going to be soft or flexible on China, he'll be killed." So this is an example of how difficult it is to get peace in the world, because countries get locked into positions. And in the United States today, it's politically impossible for any of the politicians to stand up and say, "Hey, why don't we reboot and consider a different policy towards China?" That's impossible.
我再补充一下，中国的经济预计在未来10到15年超越美国，而美国的抵制并非特殊事件，而是所有守成大国的惯性反应。对比历史，从英国对德国，从美国对苏联，都遵循着类似的轨迹。短期摩擦不可避免，但关键在于是否有沟通的机制，避免演变成失控冲突。那到底中国是在摧毁资本主义，还是在释放企业家的能量呢？
I would say that on the subject you just raised, is there a cultural revolution taking place or coming back to China? I can say confidently that there are two schools of thought. The first school of thought, I would say, is what you will find in the Anglo-Saxon media, that this is clearly Xi Jinping going back to the ideological roots of the Chinese Communist Party and saying the time has come now, China is rich enough, now we can go back to socialism, we're going to crack down on these big firms, big tech, and now focus on redistributing the pie. And as you know, the phrase used is common prosperity, and let's take care of people at the bottom, and so on and so forth. So, and if that happens, of course, if indeed he's cracking down on industries and big tech and big money and all that, then you could see, in a sense, in theory, a retreat from capitalism. People will stop investing in China, and frankly, the Chinese economy will collapse. Okay, so that's school number one. And I would say it is. I don't rule it out completely. You know, I don't say there's a zero prospect of that happening. You know, but there is another school of thought that says that actually Xi Jinping appreciates what China has accomplished under the free market system. Its economy has grown faster than any other countries in the last 30 years, right? I mean, just imagine that in purchasing power parity terms, China's GNP was 10% of the United States in 1980. 2014, it became bigger in PPP terms. In nominal market terms, the US GNP was 8 times the size of China's. Now it's only 1.5 times larger. So this had a tremendous track record. But he thinks that at this point in time, there have also been some excesses have developed. Excesses have developed in the sense of the big firms becoming too large and monopolistic and trying to control the regulators in the same way that big tech in the United States controls the regulators in Washington, D.C. So as you know, in my book, I have a chapter on how the United States has become functionally a plutocracy, which is a government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. And Xi Jinping is saying, I do not want a plutocracy in China, and I'd rather that we break down the power of these large monopolistic giants. And that's what he's doing. And if that's what he's doing, paradoxically, he may actually unleash entrepreneurial energy by restricting the power of the big tech. Because today, and in fact there was an article in the Financial Times today, if I'm not mistaken, saying that the big tech in the US is so successful, every time a potential competitor emerges, they gobble it up before it can become big enough to be a threat. And there's a guy who's a real expert on artificial intelligence. He's one of the biggest investors in artificial intelligence. He's written one of the definitive books on it. His name is Li Kai-fu. And I heard him speak at an interview with The Economist. And in the interview, he's invested in 1,000 startups in China. He says all these new moves make it easier for his startups to succeed because they can no longer be eaten up by the giants. So paradoxically, even though in theory Xi Jinping is cracking down on big tech, actually he may be unleashing entrepreneurial energy. Now, frankly, which school of thought is correct? Is Xi Jinping destroying capitalism in China, or is Xi Jinping rejuvenating capitalism in China? The two schools of thought. We'll find out within 10 years. But I, as a betting man, I place my bets on the second school of thought.
Okay.
其实这里的关键在于视角。第一种解读认为共同富裕意味着走向再分配，压制投资，经济或许会放缓。而第二种则指出，限制科技巨头的垄断，反而有可能会释放更多的创业能量。马凯硕认为，中国经济的长期潜力依然值得重视，而不是轻易的唱衰。他的提醒是不要轻易对中国下注。中美竞争是长期的趋势，但中国的经济和社会调整有可能会孕育新的动能。从130年的格局逆转到减贫的历史成就，中国的发展道路依然在展开中。
Well, I think the one thing we can learn from China is that you can take a country where in 1980, about the figures vary, like 80 to 90% of the people lived in poverty, okay? 80 to 90%. And today it's almost down to zero. China's poverty eradication program is the most impressive and most successful poverty eradication program in human history. It's a tremendous accomplishment. For me, poverty eradication is actually very important because actually I was born in poverty. You know, I know what it's like. I was put in a special feeding program when I was 6 years old. I didn't have a flush toilet. I've lived through all that. So I think eradicating poverty should be the number one moral imperative in the world, and China is the leading example of how it can be done and how we should learn lessons from China in that area. And in terms of how we adapt to China, I think it is a fact that whenever a new great power emerges, the world order has got to change and reorient itself, right? And the question is whether or not, to put it very simply, will China emerge as an angry dragon or a peaceful dragon? And we don't know the answer to that, because it's what we do today that will determine whether China emerges as an angry dragon or as a peaceful dragon. I think both are possible, which is why my thesis is that we should try to work with China as it is rising and persuade China to accept the current Western rules-based order that is a gift from the West to the rest of the world. And fortunately, as of now, China actually loves the rules-based order, because China has succeeded in developing so well in the last 30 years because the rules-based order has facilitated China's rise. So the World Trade Organization is responsible for China emerging as the world's number one trading power today. So it is not in China's interest to disrupt the rules-based order. But all this can work out if you work out an understanding with China. But if there is no understanding with China, and if there is growing tension and conflict, then it is possible that China could emerge as an angry dragon. Then I think the world will be a less comfortable place.
各位，在浩哥观察室这个频道，我会挑选全球最有影响力的学者观点，与大家一起理解他们的思考。在这里，你们能听到这些人生的答案。如果你真的想听懂世界格局，那就欢迎订阅，与我一起冷静观察大事，找到属于我们的思考角度。